Hi, I'm Mrs. Lemons, and I'm here to help you review for that US History EOC. Before I start reminding you about the past, I want you to see what you already remember. So pause the video here and brainstorm. So let's get started with a quick review. Hopefully you're already familiar and you remember the things that I'm going to talk about in this video, but if anything is fuzzy or unclear, be sure that you write it down and look it up later. When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, that ended the Civil War, and it brought about a lot of questions. The main question being, how are we going to reunite the nation and get the southern states who seceded and now have just surrendered, how are we going to get them back into the Union? And that's the main question that Reconstruction answered. Now, President Lincoln had wanted the country to reunite as quickly as possible because that had been his goal all along. So he wanted to be lenient towards the South. He just wanted everybody to reunite. However, not everybody agreed with him, and also Abraham Lincoln unfortunately was assassinated only a few days after the surrender at Appomattox. The other big question of the Reconstruction era is what to do with the freedmen, the former slaves, because in 1865 the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which abolished slavery in the United States. So it was a great amendment getting rid of slavery, and now the question is, what do we do with everyone who used to be a slave? Because unfortunately they fell into a category that in the financial world today we refer to as ninjas. Not that kind of ninja. It stands for no income, no job, or assets. Ninja. The former slaves didn't have anything, and the question was, how do we help them? Or do we even want to help them? You know, a lot of people in the South were still really racist, and they didn't want to help them. So in the early Reconstruction era, there were some attempts to help the freedmen, one of which being the Freedmen's Bureau. Some people argued that the freedmen should be given land and tools to work it. Their rallying cry became 40 acres and a mule. But unfortunately, due to many reasons, the Freedmen's Bureau failed, one of which being continued racism in the South, another of which being struggles and disagreements between President Andrew Johnson and Congress, which at this point was largely dominated by radical Republicans because people in the North and West saw that the South was still being really racist, as evidenced by this broadside on the slide that I have here. So they voted these radical Republicans into Congress because they were saying, we want the South to pay for what they did, we want to punish them, and we want to help the former slaves. Since President Johnson was kind of wishy-washy on all of that and he didn't really agree, the radical Republicans actually set a trap for him by creating a law that they knew he would break, the Tenure of Office Act, and they impeached President Andrew Johnson. Now, the Senate acquitted him by a close margin, so President Johnson didn't actually leave office, but his presidency was very weak after that point. Who's the other president who was impeached but not removed? President Bill Clinton, that's correct, for very different reasons, but yes, he's the only other president in U.S. history to be impeached. So on the other side of the political aisle, the Democrats were mainly made of the white Southern elites who were still in power and still racist, unfortunately. They were making laws across the South known as black codes, which were laws that said things like, if you're black, you can't enter into a contract, or if you're black, you can't get a job, or if you're black, you can't go to this school. Basically, they were laws that were designed to keep African Americans in the same status or worse than they had experienced during slavery. Not only were they making racist laws, but there were terrorist hate groups out murdering people, like the KKK. And in terms of economic opportunity, really the primary form was for the former slaves to kind of keep doing what they had been doing and working on the plantations, but now they were working as sharecroppers, where they were getting a small share of the crop that they were working as quote-unquote payment. Unfortunately, that payment was pretty much never enough to even pay back the money they had to use to rent their tools and things like that. So they were trapped in this constant cycle of debt, which is known as debt peonage. So after a few years of Reconstruction, nothing had really changed. The South was still really racist, and the rest of the country wasn't going to stand for it. So what did they do? Well, they tried changing the Constitution again. The 14th Amendment was ratified, and that defined citizenship for the first time, guaranteed every citizen equal protection and due process under the law. Basically, that was a direct response to the black codes to make laws like that illegal. They also ratified the 15th Amendment. And when I say they, I'm talking about the North and the West, because keep in mind at this point, the South, for the most part, they hadn't rejoined the Union yet. So the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. Didn't say anything about gender, just race. And then they also elected a Civil War hero general as President of the United States, President Ulysses S. Grant. And under Grant and the Radical Republicans, they divided the South into military districts and sent the U.S. military down to rule the South. Under military rule, things were better for a little while in some ways. Voter intimidation tactics like the one in this political cartoon they were stopped, basically. And African Americans were able to vote for who they chose, which was pretty much the Republican Party, since the Democrats were the white Southern elites who were part of the KKK. However, speaking of the KKK, the government also made laws known as the Enforcement Acts to actually put a stop to the terrorism of the KKK. So some things were better. Some things were different, but not exactly better. There were people who became known as carpetbaggers, which was a derogatory term, who came down from the North and took advantage of the South to try to make money, basically. And then, sharecropping was still going on, and that was still really the only economic opportunity available to African Americans, although I hesitate to use that term because it wasn't really an economic opportunity. It was still basically slavery. And then by the time 1873 rolled around, the rest of the country was kind of losing focus on the South, losing interest, and they especially lost interest when the stock market crashed due to a financial panic. And by the time the next presidential election rolled around, the rest of the country had largely stopped caring about the issues in the South, which was sad because the issues in the South really hadn't been resolved at that point. But ultimately, when the presidential election results were contested, Congress drew up what's known as the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction. The Republicans got the winning presidential candidate, Rutherford Hayes, and the Democrats got the end of military rule in the South and the end of the Reconstruction era. So this political cartoon sums up a lot about Reconstruction. I want you to pause the video and analyze it. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to look at the video, I hope you pause the video. If you didn't, pause it, analyze it, and then press play after you've done that. We've got our two presidents. We've got Grant here from 1869 to 1877, and then we've got Rutherford Hayes here from 1877 to 1881. Under Grant, the solid South was being oppressed by carpetbag rule and military occupation, as you see here, and the cartoonist labeled as the quote-unquote strong government. And then as soon as Reconstruction ended, Hayes adopted let 'em alone policy and buried the carpetbag and basically just let the South go back to their old ways. And so began the ultimate low point of race relations between whites and blacks in the United States, which is known as the nadir. This political cartoon kind of says it all. We've got the Union as it was. This is a white man's government. That's how it was before the Civil War. And then right here, I kind of drew over it. It says the lost cause. And we've got the KKK and the White League member, which the White League was another terrorist hate group, just like the KKK. We've got them joining hands over the lost cause, which is slavery. And even though slavery's over, the cartoonist has pointed out that what we now have is actually worse than slavery, because, you know, we don't even have plantation owners caring if their labor force stays alive because they have basically no economic investment in them. So the nadir was a time period of Jim Crow laws, segregation, the era of poll taxes and literacy tests, which were designed to be barriers to the 15th Amendment and prevent African Americans from voting, even though the Constitution said they could. And let's not forget the kids. So generations after generations of African Americans were trapped in debt by sharecropping systems and tenant farming systems. And really there was little to no access to education for African Americans. And unfortunately, the nadir lasted for a long time. There's debate among historians over the actual dates of the nadir, but really things didn't start to improve for African Americans until when? Take a moment and think about like a decade. When do you think they started to improve? Okay, I would argue that a significant improvement didn't really start to happen until the 1960s. So we're talking almost 100 years of oppression, discrimination, lack of access to education and economic opportunity. Now, during that time, of course, there were things like the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, and African Americans were able to serve in the military. And in the 1950s, they actually desegregated the military. So there were advances. There were also advances in sports, like Jackie Robinson is a great example, the first African-American Major League Baseball player. But really, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that, that new laws and new constitutional amendments were passed to try to put an end to the discrimination and barriers to success for African Americans. So that's Reconstruction in a nutshell. Sometimes timelines can be very useful to kind of piece everything together, and if you find that they help you, then you can pause the video here on this timeline and copy it down into your notes. Okay, let's do a practice question. Sometimes there's no better way to review and practice for a multiple choice test than practicing multiple choice questions. But in this case, we're also going to practice a test-taking tip, one of my personal favorites, and that is to treat multiple choice questions like they're short answer questions. Okay, what do I mean by that? Basically, I mean you should look at the question. Okay, so here's the question right here. You should look at the question, and then of course if there's a document that you need to examine along with a question, like so, then also examine the document, and then think about what some possible answers are before you look at the answer choices. Okay, so I've forced you to do that in the video because I didn't put the answer choices on this slide. On the EOC, you know, there's not like a tool that you can use to do this, but you can use your hand or your scratch paper to cover up the multiple choice questions so that they don't poison your mind, I like to say, before you've thought about the question. The reason why I think this is really a good strategy to try is that oftentimes the wrong answer choices, the distractors on multiple choice questions can be very distracting, and you sometimes will look at them and then you'll get swayed away from, like the point of the question, and the history that you remember. So treat it like a short answer question. That's my advice. So basically what I want you to do right now is pause the video, read the question and the document, and then brainstorm. In this case, since the question is the law above was most likely supported by, I want you to brainstorm some people and groups who might have supported the law that's in the document. Okay, now that you've brainstormed, I'm going to show you the answer choices, and I want you to pause the video and think about which answer choice you think is correct. The correct answer is Democrats. Most of the white Southern elites at this time were Democrats, and they did not support expanding rights for African Americans. In fact, they wanted, for the most part, to keep them in a condition that was as close to slavery as possible, or even potentially a little bit worse. So, of course, generalizations, you've got to be careful when you make them. There were surely, some white Southern elites who were not racist and who wanted change, but for the most part, that's what was going on at that time in history, and that's why the correct answer is B, Democrats. I hope you found this review helpful. Thanks for watching, and if you feel like you need to do further research, or you need more review for Reconstruction Era, I recommend Googling Reconstruction Era history and reading a few articles about it to kind of fill in the gaps of this review. But thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.